January 1945. Camp Aliceville, Alabama. Gefreiter Rolf Miller, a 20-year-old veteran of the Eastern Front, is on kitchen duty. He has been in the camp for 3 months and has grown accustomed to the white bread, the butter, the real coffee. He has gained 8 kilograms, but he still holds to the old ways, stuffing leftover bread crusts into his pockets. Waste is a sin. His job this afternoon: clear the garbage from the American Guard's mess. He drags the heavy metal bin to the back. When he lifts the lid, a sour smell hits him. But it is not the smell of rot that makes him freeze. Inside is an unimaginable pile. Dozens of slices of white bread, barely touched. Half-eaten baked potatoes. And worst of all, meat. Large, juicy chunks of roast beef, discarded for being too fatty. Rolf is motionless. He stares into the bin. This single can of trash is more food than his entire family in Berlin sees in a week. This is not wealth. This is an obscenity. He feels a wave of nausea. It is the moment he knows, with absolute certainty, that Germany has lost. The German soldiers' horror at that garbage can was not an accident. It was the end result of a decade of intense national conditioning. Adolf Hitler, haunted by the memory of the 1918 British blockade that starved the German home front and broke its will, was pathologically obsessed with food as a weapon. The entire Nazi economic system was built around the concept of autarky, total self-sufficiency. But Germany was not self-sufficient. It needed the resources of others. This created a national mindset where scarcity was the default, and waste was a crime against the state. From the moment the war began, this scarcity was managed by German industrial chemistry, giving rise to the world of Ersatz, substitute. Everything was extended. Coffee was no longer made from beans, but from roasted acorns and barley. Bread, the staple of the German diet, was bulked out with potato flour, pea meal, and by 1944, often sawdust, to make it seem more filling. Butter was margarine. Sausages contained less and less meat, and more soy or filler. This was not just a civilian problem. The Wehrmacht marched on its stomach, and its stomach was fed this same joyless, chemical diet. The German Lanzer on the Eastern Front was fueled by Kommissbrot, a dense, dark rye bread, and tins of Fleischkonserve, processed, salty meat. He was in a state of perpetual, managed hunger. Propaganda from Joseph Goebbels reinforced this. He praised German frugality as a sign of moral purity. He painted the Allies, particularly America, as decadent, weak, and inefficient. But more importantly, he painted them as starving. German newsreels, using staged or out-of-context images from the Great Depression, proved that America was a nation of breadlines, on the verge of total economic collapse. The German soldier, therefore, was conditioned to believe 2 things: that his own hunger was a noble sacrifice, and that his enemy was just as hungry, if not more so. On the other side of the Atlantic, an entirely different world existed. The United States was a continent untouched by war, a vast agricultural powerhouse that had spent the 1930s suffering not from scarcity, but from crop surpluses. When America entered the war, its industrial and agricultural might, already the largest in the world, was mobilized. The arsenal of democracy was also the world's breadbasket. American factories produced tanks and planes, while its farms produced a staggering, almost limitless supply of wheat, corn, beef, and pork. This abundance was reflected in the U.S. Army's logistical doctrine. The Quartermaster Corps was not designed to manage scarcity. It was designed to project overwhelming abundance. It operated on a push system. It did not wait for a frontline unit to request food. It pushed a standardized, massive quantity of rations forward, assuming a high rate of consumption, loss, and waste. While the German Lancer ate Ersatz bread, the American GI was the best-fed soldier in history. His C-Rations were canned meals of meat and beans, or beef stew. His K-Rations provided 3 separate, balanced meals: breakfast, dinner, and supper, in waxed boxes, complete with cigarettes, chewing gum, and soluble coffee. The D-Ration was a 4-ounce bar of fortified chocolate, an item of pure luxury. This logistical reality collided with a legal one, the 1929 Geneva Convention. The United States was a signatory and, as a matter of national honor and policy, intended to follow its rules. Article 11 was explicit. Prisoners of war shall be treated as regards food on the same basis as the depot troops of the captor's army. For America, depot troops, soldiers in training camps or on rear line duty, ate extremely well. This meant that when hundreds of thousands of German prisoners were shipped from the battlefields of North Africa and Europe to camps across the United States, they were legally entitled to this same high-calorie diet. The U.S. My Army did not see this as a problem. It was a simple logistical calculation. The same system that fed its own troops would now simply feed its prisoners. The German soldier, captured, defeated, and conditioned by years of propaganda and ersatz hunger, was about to collide with a reality that was not just different from his own, but incomprehensibly, obscenely superior. For the German POW, the initial shock of receiving good food, the white bread, the real coffee, the meat, was profound. But this shock was quickly rationalized. He could see it as a temporary display, a propaganda effort by the Americans, or a short-term surplus. It was unbelievable, but perhaps explainable. The second shock, however, was the one that was psychologically indefensible, the shock of waste. This was not a rationalization. It was a moral crisis. The German soldier was a product of a culture where waste was, by 1945, tantamount to treason. A civilian on the home front could be severely punished for throwing away food. A soldier learned to hoard every crust of bread, to boil leather for sustenance, to survive. Frugality was a virtue. Waste was a sin. Then he arrived at Camp Aliceville, or Camp Hearn. He was assigned to kitchen duty, and he saw a young American guard, barely 20, scrape a full, uneaten plate of beef stew and potatoes into a garbage can simply because he was full. This act was more terrifying than a P-51 Mustang. It was a display of power so absolute, so casual, that it bordered on the divine. It suggested that the enemy operated in a different reality, one where the most fundamental laws of survival, the laws that governed all of Germany, simply did not apply. This American, this decadent, starving boy from the propaganda posters, was treating a feast as trash. This sight did not just suggest the propaganda was a lie, it proved that the propaganda was the opposite of the truth. The logistical angle, a system of surplus. This waste was not an accident. It was a designed structural component of the American logistical system. The U.S. Quartermaster Corps, unlike its German counterpart, was not built to manage scarcity. It was built to project overwhelming, brute force abundance. The system was called push logistics. The German army, by contrast, ran on a pull system. A frontline unit requested exactly what it needed, and the supply chain struggled to deliver it. This was efficient in theory, but brittle in practice. The American push system was the opposite. It was inefficient by design, but terrifyingly robust. The Quartermaster Corps calculated the needs of its army and its prisoners, and pushed that amount, plus a massive surplus forward. It did not care if a unit was at full strength or had taken casualties. It did not care if the men were tired of C-Rations. It sent the full allotment every day. The result, inevitably, was staggering waste. This was simply calculated into the equation. It was better to have 50% waste and a 100% full army than to have 0% waste and a 90% full army. This is what the German POW witnessed. He was seeing the byproduct of a system so vast that it found it cheaper to throw food away than to create the complex bureaucracy needed to conserve it. The overflowing garbage bin was, in its own way, the most accurate symbol of American industrial might. The German POW was a product of an Ersatz, substitute culture. He was conditioned to accept, and even take a strange pride in, the chemical ingenuity of his nation. He drank acorn coffee, ate flour stretched with pea meal, and wore boots with synthetic soles. His entire world was about making do with inferior, scientifically engineered substitutes. This was framed as a triumph of German resourcefulness over the Allied blockades. The American GI, in stark contrast, was the product of a disposable, consumer culture of realness. His abundance was not just in quantity, but in quality. The German soldier's shock was not just seeing bread being wasted, but white bread, a luxury item reserved for the Nazi elite. He wasn't just seeing coffee, but real coffee, not the bitter acorn sludge he'd been drinking. This extended to every aspect of the camp. The German soldier was issued sturdy work clothes, real leather boots, and thick wool blankets. In the camp, PX, post-exchange, he could buy items that were pure fantasy back home: Coca-Cola, Hershey's chocolate bars, and endless cartons of real tobacco cigarettes, not the dried leaves and fillers he was used to. The American system did not understand substitutes. It only understood mass production of the genuine article. This collision of the Ersatz mind with the real economy was profoundly disorienting. It suggested that America's lowest standard of living, for its prisoners, was higher than Germany's highest standard of living, for its master race. The waste was merely the most visible symptom of this terrifying, unbridgeable gap in quality. The backlash angle, the American home front. This entire situation was made even more surreal by the fact that the American people were also on rations. While the U.S. home front was not starving by any measure, the war effort demanded sacrifice. Civilians had ration books for sugar, meat, coffee, and gasoline. Victory gardens were a patriotic duty. Waste not, want not was a national slogan. By 1944, as American casualty lists from Normandy and Italy grew, a deep resentment began to brew. Newspapers, especially in towns near the 500-plus POW camps across the country, began publishing scathing stories. They reported that German prisoners were being coddled, that they were eating better than our boys at the front. There were reports of German POWs being fed steak, chicken, and ice cream, while American civilians had to use their precious ration stamps for basic ground beef. In one famous incident, a community was outraged to learn that the local POW camp was receiving a larger allotment of fresh meat than their entire town. This public anger, which reached the halls of Congress, highlights the central irony. The U.S. Army, by simply following the Geneva Convention and feeding its prisoners the same as its own non-combat depot troops, was providing a diet that was better than that of the rationed American civilian. The waste that horrified the German POW was also infuriating the American taxpayer. This domestic backlash is perhaps the most concrete, verifiable proof of just how staggering the abundance truly was. The turning point was not a single battle, but a cumulative, psychological surrender that happened in mess halls and behind kitchens, across America, every single day. For Gefreiter Rolf Miller, that moment at the garbage can in Alabama was his climax. But for others, it was a different, equally absurd display of abundance. Consider a Panzer Grenadier, captured in the frozen hell of the Ardennes, where his unit had been reduced to eating snow and their own pack animals. He is shipped to Camp Hearn, Texas. It is July 1944. The heat is oppressive, a physical blow. He and his comrades are miserable, baking in the Texas sun. The camp commandant, a U.S. Army colonel, worries about morale. Low morale leads to unrest, escape attempts, and sickness. His solution is the same one he would apply to his own GIs in training: provide a morale boost. One afternoon, a truck arrives. The prisoners are ordered into line. They shuffle forward, expecting the usual: bread, stew, perhaps beans. Instead, an American cook, in a white apron, slops a scoop of pale, cold, sweet-smelling something onto their trays. It is ice cream. The German soldiers stop. They stare at this. Ice cream is not food. It is not a ration. It is a symbol of childhood, of peacetime, of Sunday afternoons at a cafe with their families. It is a frivolous, luxurious, impossible thing to have in the middle of a total war, and the Americans are serving it to them. By the gallon. This was the cognitive break. This was the moment of absolute, irrefutable defeat. The German soldier's mind, conditioned for totaler Krieg, total war, could not process an enemy that possessed a surplus of luxury. It was one thing to be defeated by a nation that had more tanks. It was another to be defeated by a nation that had so much milk, sugar, and logistical capacity that it could casually waste it on its enemies in the form of a frozen dessert. This was not war as they understood it. This was an industrial equation they could never hope to solve. The propaganda posters of the starving America were not just a lie. They were a cruel, cosmic joke. This realization spread through the camps, becoming a kind of dark humor. The prisoners, now convinced of the war's outcome, began to see these displays of waste not just with horror, but with a kind of morbid fascination. They were witnesses to their own nation's obsolescence. The apex of this phenomenon was the cigarette. In war-torn Germany, tobacco was rarer than gold. Civilians and soldiers alike smoked Ersatz cigarettes, often rolled from dried leaves, herbs, or whatever scraps could be found. A real American cigarette was a unit of currency, a treasure. In the American POW camps, cigarettes were an afterthought. They were issued as part of the standard ration, as plentiful as bread. The U.S. Army, operating on the belief that a well-supplied soldier or prisoner was a calm one, distributed them by the carton. It was not uncommon for a single POW to receive 20 packs a month. This sheer smokable quantity was one thing. The waste was another. German prisoners, assigned to clean the American Guards barracks, would find half-smoked Lucky Strikes and Camels, still an inch or two long, stubbed out in ashtrays or tossed on the floor. A German veteran, who just months earlier would have risked sniper fire to retrieve a discarded cigarette butt from the mud of Normandy, was now sweeping piles of them into a dustpan. He would see a young American guard light a fresh cigarette, take 2 puffs, then toss it away because he was called to duty. This was the final grinding evidence. This was a nation that did not just waste its food, it wasted its luxuries. It casually discarded items that men were killing for back in Europe. This wasn't a display of power, like a B-17 bomber. It was a display of reality. It was the mundane, everyday, unthinking proof that America operated on a level of material wealth that made Germany's entire, desperate, 4-year struggle for Lebensraum, living space, seemed like a pathetic, tragic failure. The war was over, and the proof was in the trash. This psychological surrender was soon reflected physically. The German POWs, who had arrived gaunt, sallow-skinned, hollow-eyed, and often lice-ridden, began to thrive. In a supreme irony of the war, the American POW camp became the healthiest environment they had lived in for years. The regular, high-calorie meals, the absence of frontline combat stress, and the access to American medical and dental care had a profound effect. On average, German prisoners in American camps gained weight, anywhere from 15 to 30 pounds. They were, quite literally, being fattened by their enemy. This physical transformation was a walking, talking, undeniable symbol of American superiority. The Herrenvolk, the master race that had been told of its physical supremacy, was now being nursed back to health by the decadent nation it had been sent to conquer. But the impact was not just physical, it changed their behavior. The initial horror at the waist gave way to a pragmatic acceptance and even participation. The German prisoners became subtly Americanized. In the camp kitchens, German POWs learned to bake American-style white bread. They learned to prepare cuts of meat they had never seen. They began to complain, an unthinkable act in the Wehrmacht, when they didn't like a meal. They became picky. They would throw away the parts they didn't like, just as their American guards did. They had learned the luxury of waste. Months earlier, they were German soldiers fighting for scarcity. Now, they were behaving like American consumers. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, but for the nearly 400,000 German POWs on American soil, their journey was far from over. Repatriation was slow. Many remained in the U.S. working on farms and in lumber yards until 1946 or 1947 as part of the post-war labor arrangement. When they were finally shipped home, they faced the ultimate and most horrifying inversion of their experience. They left a nation of unimaginable abundance and returned to one of total starvation. This was the Stunde Null, or 0 hour. Germany was a wasteland. The Allied bombing campaign and the final battles had shattered its infrastructure. There were no trains, no functioning farms, no supply system. The civilian population, which had been surviving on Ersatz rations, now had nothing. The average daily diet in cities like Berlin or Hamburg in 1946 fell below 100 calories. People were, quite literally, starving in the streets. The returning POWs created a bizarre, jarring visual. They stepped off the repatriation ships looking healthy, strong, and well-fed. They were the picture of health, arriving in a nation of skeletons. This image was the final devastating proof of American power. The U.S. had not only defeated Germany, but it had fed its captured armies, while Germany's own government had led its people into ruin. The returning soldier, with his healthy complexion and filled-out uniform, was a living testament to the propaganda lie. He brought home not just his memories, but the physical evidence, written on his own body, that the enemy he was told was starving was, in fact, the most abundant nation on earth. War is a contest of wills, of tactics, and of steel. But the Second World War was, more than any other, a war of production lines. It was a mathematical problem. And Germany's equation was built on scarcity, plunder, and Ersatz substitutes. America's was built on a surplus so vast it was almost exponential. The German soldier's horror at a garbage can was not just a personal anecdote. It was the precise moment an ideology collapsed. It was the realization that the Third Reich had not been defeated by a superior soldier or a braver spirit, but by a system, a relentless, industrial machine that could produce, ship, and ultimately waste more food than Germany could ever hope to create. That discarded half-eaten potato, that stubbed-out cigarette, that scoop of ice cream, these were not just trash. They were weapons. They were symbols of a power so total that it did not even need to be demonstrated with bombs. It was a power that could afford to be humane, to follow the rules, and in doing so, prove its own victory was not just military, but absolute. The war was won not by the nation that was best at enduring hunger, but by the one that had made hunger obsolete.